Hey, welcome back. This week we're covering Sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to take a quick minute and just make sure there was some clarification. Most people have got this down, especially at this point in the semester, but just a couple people are still having some questions regarding what is a mental map, especially regarding the geographic analysis assignment. So the geographic analysis assignment is not this. The mental map questions are in your discussion forum every week, and the geographic analysis is on the very last pages of the chapter. Please don't forget that on the last several pages of your syllabus, I have broken everything down for a week to week, what you have due, and then even after that, it's broken down by assignment. So please use that as a reference. There's also more descriptions in the syllabus, again, describing what is due, when it is due, where it is due. If you have any questions, don't forget to email me. So again, this week we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa. This is just, I put the mental map up there just so people knew what I'm talking about regarding the discussion questions. They're a little bit different. This is the one I would use if I was in a class, not an online class. So anyway, Sub-Saharan Africa, several countries, more than 44 countries. There's some quite a bit of territories as well if you include a lot of the islands that surround the continent. So Sub-Sahara is below the Sahara. There are a couple countries up here which are partially included. The newest country, I believe it's still the newest country in the world, is actually South Sudan. I'm going to get the year wrong. I'm going to say it was 2011 that it was formed. So Sudan and South Sudan were one country, and they split. Which we don't talk about it too much in this class, but in Geography 2000 we talk about quite a bit more about how a country becomes a country and how it's recognized as a country. So this is the newest country that we have that's legally recognized by the United Nations and supporting countries. Okay, so as normal, I've got some of the brief review of the learning objectives you can use as your notes. Okay, here was the NAC number, not 44. We have 48 states in this region, one territory. So we're approximately almost 1 billion people. And as we get to South Asia and East Asia, we have more people in both of those regions. And actually, we have more people in India. We have more people in just China than we do in this entire region. However, it's the world's fastest growing population. 43% of the population is under 15 years old. So if you think about your population pyramids, this is almost half of the population. We're going to have a very pyramid shape, very traditional triangular shape. This is the least developed region in the world. Approximately 37% is urbanized, and cities are growing very rapidly. A lot of people moving into cities, and this is part of, remember we talked about South and Latin America. We talked about, like squatter settlements and slums and cities having a difficult time providing infrastructure and needs for people who are immigrating into the cities. This is definitely true for this region as well. Culturally speaking, this is a very complex region. But we also have a lot of economies that are growing and booming. Nigeria is a big one. So there's not a lot of access to the world market, but things are rapidly changing in this region. Here I have a little YouTube video of some of the language intricacies. Just think it's really interesting, some of the languages we have this region. So please take a minute and stop and go check out the link. But again, we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to language. Linguistically speaking, it's an amazing region. So some of the recurring themes that we're going to see, colonial legacy of settler colonies and indirect rule, which still goes on today. We've talked about colonialism, neo-colonialism. This region was pretty much the last region to hold out to be colonized, and this was largely because of diseases, especially malaria. But this isn't something, once quinine was discovered, basically this region lost its natural protection. There's a lot of similar export crops, but again, these are large crops that are not consumed by local populations. Cacao, for example, which they use to make chocolate, peanuts, coffee, cloves, versus local crops that people, or I should say crops that people use to consume locally within the country. So millet, um, which is like sorghum, peas, cassava, also known as yucca. I think some people might call it yucca in the States. It's a root, kind of like a potato, starchy. Corn as well. There was a video a few years ago. You could probably find it on YouTube as well. And somebody took those cacao farmers and they took them some chocolate that had been processed. I don't know, it's German or Swiss chocolate, maybe American chocolate. And they went and actually took them the processed chocolate. If you've ever seen cacao, it comes in a pod, and you cut it open. It's got the cacao beans, which are what we use to convert into chocolate, are inside this white, pulpy, I'm not even really sure. I mean, it's a fruit, right? So you've got the beans and they're covered by this white pulp and they're packed in there. So it's how you make chocolate is you take it out, you crack open the pod, usually with a machete or a large knife. You put the fruit with the cacao bean, or nibs, we would call it once it's processed, with the fruit, and you would wrap it like in banana leaves. You hang it in the sun and you let it ferment for a few days. And all of the pulp just dissolves. It goes away. It's still there. It's very mushy, and you got to mix it and stir it a little bit. And then basically you lie it down on the ground, like a hot surface, to let it dry from the sun. After that, anything of the remaining of the pulp is gone. And then it would go through a process where you roast it, and then you shuck it, kind of, you pass it through a machine where it gets the shell off. And then you have the nib, which is inside, but it's very bitter. And that's what we use to process. If you've ever had like a straight up cacao nib, that's what I'm talking about. So then we process that, mixing it with sugar and mixing it with milk to get our final product, depending on which country you're from, depending on which kind of chocolate you like. You know, if you have a very dark chocolate, it's much more bitter than milk chocolate, for example. So a lot of these farmers, we're talking about people who are making dollars a day if they're lucky. They've never tried chocolate. And so anyways, to go back to my point, as I go off to explain the whole process to you. So somebody brings this cacao farmer a bar of chocolate, and he tries it for the first time in his life. And it's amazing to see his face. I haven't seen the video in a few years, but I remember he expressed something like, now I understand why people like this stuff. You know, if you just have cacao and you try it before you send out, you're like, why would people like this? It's so bitter. And what I also remember about this video was, I think, you know, most of us, if something, you know, we get the opportunity to eat something that's delicious and it's from another country, a lot of us would probably want to hold on to it. Maybe not share a lot of it. And his first reaction was, I'm going to go and take this to my friends, who I believe are family, who are also cacao farmers, and let them try. I remember that specifically as being, wow, it's such a different perspective, where our perspective in this country tends to be a lot more individualistic, a lot more egotistic, a lot greedier in many ways. Okay, sorry to get back on topic here. So a lot of commonality in export crops. You do have as they're gaining access to a global market, there are more high value fresh fruits and vegetables that are being planted that are mainly being exported to Europe. Another reoccurring theme that we see is rapid urbanization throughout the region. Interestingly enough, South Africa, I think it's just Johannesburg, I'd have to go back and check, but they're cutting off the water. There's a drought and they're cutting off the water. And again, this is partially rapid urbanization, not being able to provide resources, not having enough natural resources to support the population, as well as natural occurrences such as droughts. A debt crisis. This is another huge recurring theme. Many countries in this region are highly indebted. What highly indebted poor countries is what they're being referred to as your book. They have been more or less forced into funding schemes by World Bank, IMF, as we talked about a little bit with the Caribbean and the movie, what was the debt? Sorry, I cannot think very well today. The Life and Debt movie of Jamaica, where we talked about direct investments and structured loan systems. We'll talk a little bit more about that today as well. And finally, patriarchy. It's a very patriarchal system. There are quite a few countries that have, they're largely tribes, I should say, and very matriarchal. But generally speaking, there's a high total fertility rate for the region. If we go back to think about the population indicators we talked about and looked at compared to other countries, this region was very high for a lot of those, except for life expectancy, right? Very low for life expectancy, very high for infant mortality, very high for fertility rates, for example, high for growth. Okay, so our first section, physical geography and environmental issues. This is the largest landmass straddling the equator. We have huge, extensive areas of geologic uplift, especially the Great Rift Valley. I'm not going to go into this too much because your book goes into quite a bit more. There's great amounts of biodiversity. Contrary to what most people believe, there's also a lot of water resources. They just might not be where you need them, and they're also seasonally distributed. And this is a very wealthy region in respects of minerals. Some of the problems we see are poor soils, generally very poor soils. If you kind of think about the tropics and subtropics as well in South America, that's also another factor we talked about with deforestation. The majority of the richness being in the flora, the plants that exist above the ground, not necessarily in the soil, disease, and also drought. So again, it's a bit of a disparity there, but we have, or a bit of a difference, right? There's a lot of water resources, but there's also a lot of drought. So we have high elevations in the southern and eastern Africa. You'll see your quizzes this week. There's not just one quiz, but there's Eastern Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. I'm trying to remember all of the other ones. Central Africa maybe. And there are quite a few significant mountain ranges as well. Here you can see, so this is part of what we call the Great Escarpment. So it's this landform rim that surrounds much of southern Africa, which is basically a high cliff separating two completely level areas, as we see here with Victoria Falls. Here's probably the most famous high mountain in the region, Mount Kilimanjaro. So again, there's a lot of watersheds, a lot of large rivers, Congo, Niger, the Nile, which goes up north, the Zambezi, and we'll talk about Nile next week. There's also a lot of, and we'll talk about some water issues more when we get to other regions, but there are some water issues over water rights and which country gets access to the water rights. Some countries building dams, for example. Soils, so generally, again, are relatively infertile. They're very old soils. The volcanic soils in the region are the most productive, as we would see with almost every other region. Climate and vegetation. So we have tropical climates that dominate the region, as well as some subtropical. You could see the equator. So again, this region literally just straddles the equator. This is the equator running right through here. Temperatures, you can see again, rainfall for most of this region is pretty seasonal. Temperatures are pretty stable, high, the red lines, right? Pretty stable throughout the region. So we do have some wet climates. The wet climates are the red, these ones here, the red and the purples and this pinkish color, so like right along here. Again, makes sense with the equator running right through. We have dry climates, so mostly up here and mostly to the south, and then we have some mild mid-latitude climates as well. There's three main biomes in this region. I'm not going to go into this too much because your book goes into it quite a bit more. We've got tropical forests, savannas, as well as deserts. These are the three large main biomes. Some of the environmental issues that this region is seeing. So this is some of the bigger ones. Again, I briefly mentioned dam construction, which causes environmental issues as well as causes political issues regarding if one country upriver starts damming and controlling the water flow, this is going to be a concern for countries downriver. There has been a lot of deforestation. There's also been a lot of reforestation, which we'll talk about, especially when we get to the Sahel. Another thing we think about this region often being dry, being a desert, but we see a desertification. So deserts are actually growing. Again, this is largely related to wood use and wood collection, kind of like what we saw in, we talked a little bit about Haiti as well. So using wood predominantly. And we'll see this, oh, sorry, one second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, environmental issues. So we talked about the reforestation. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So here's a satellite image, and you can see a little bit as well the expansiveness of the Sahara. But you can also see the stark difference here. It doesn't look quite as green here, but you can see this interior. There's a large forest area, a lot of large body water systems as well. So it's not quite as vastly dry as we think. It's just the water is located in specific regions. So desertification, or desertification, I can never say this right. Anyways, the degradation of formerly productive lands into desert-like conditions. And we'll talk about this. It's a problem that tends to be found in a lot of different regions of the world that we'll talk about. It's kind of a recurring theme. But again, when you have lands that aren't very fertile and you're not farming them in a sustainable way, they no longer can keep plants. This is also when we start chopping down trees, especially when people sometimes I think the problems that there have been, and this is one of the projects with the purpose of the Sahel, is actually growing trees so that women, you can often hear about cases of usually the job falls on women, sometimes children, but they're traveling all day long or half a day, or they're walking for miles to go and get water or to get firewood in order to cook meals. So there's been a lot of efforts, social efforts, which have benefited the environment as well to help combat some of these issues like this as well. So you can see the areas that previously were forested or at least had some plant coverage that are now converting into desert. So it brings us to the question, is it a natural phenomenon or is it human induced? Probably both, but this is much more, and this is much more so with anthropogenic forces, such as we just talked about, gathering firewood. So it is climate driven, and this is something that's going to be even exacerbated now with climate change. So it's climate driven. You see part of global atmospheric cycles. So again, drought cycles. Droughts are partially related to, well, droughts, I should say water shortages, for example. They can be naturally induced because they do come from different climate cycles, but then they can also be human induced by the fact that we're over consuming. So the same here. So exacerbated by human activities, wood cutting, overgrazing, peanut cultivation, which greatly leads to soil erosion. So deforestation is a more serious threat in the savannas than in the rainforests, except in Madagascar and the Atlantic coast forests, where it's much more of a threat for those regions. It's caused by the collection of biofuels, so primarily talking about wood. And when we say charcoal here, we're talking about old school charcoal, not this compact charcoal little briquettes that you buy at Walmart to go and have your barbecue at Kapiolani Park or the beach. But when we make charcoal in countries such as this, the same way we would do it in South America, is they burn logs and they burn pieces of wood to a point where it's burned, but you can actually still light it on fire, and that's what we call charcoal, or carbon, we would call it in Spanish as well. So rather than using commercial logging or land use conversion, it's actually more based on collection of firewood. So this is, we're going to talk about here the greening of the Sahel. The Sahel is this region of a desert. I think if you go back here, sorry, this is the Sahel along this region here. Go back. Sorry about that. So this is a region this is an area that has seen massive desertification over the last several decades, but recently there has been a shift now in greening and replanting and reforesting this region. So they've been planting trees since about 1977. This is largely driven by women, and it's to prevent soil erosion. So again, once you don't have vegetation with roots in the ground, an area is more propense to soil erosion, which you take off topsoil, any type of soil nutrients that you have are then being removed. It's also to provide firewood for people. It creates jobs for people. It helps increase food security. Um, and this is partially due to economic reasons. It's partially due to potentially wildlife coming in, soil fertility being included to improved to help then for agricultural activities. It largely helps poor women, and it promotes sustainable management of these areas. So in this over this period of time, there have been more than 50,000 members who are part of this organization, this network. They're calling it the Pan-African Greenbelt Network, which is what it's been called since 1986, and they've planted more than 30 million trees. The main woman who is behind this movement is, I cannot say her name, I'm sure, Wangari Maathai. She was the founder, and she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for her initiative in this project in 2004. So it was based on her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. So this was largely a women-led and a women-involved movement. So some of the other environmental issues, energy shortages are a major issue. If you think about how we get our energy, and again, there is a lot of water scarcity for some regions in this world. This is you can see here energy production. So a lot of the energy is coming from natural gas, oil producing. There are a couple of countries that do have large supplies of oil. So some of the countries are OPEC members, which we'll talk about a little bit more. It's oil producing, exporting countries. We always get those mixed up. We'll talk about it more when we get to the next section, the next region. But generally speaking, there are energy shortages. There has been a lot of foreign investment in oil and gas. A lot of this foreign investment over the last several years has been coming from China, in fact. But you can see here we've got down combustible renewables and waste as a percent of total energy. So quite a few countries are growing in the areas of renewables. Some countries are becoming quite high, and then other countries just have nothing. They have no resources. But with oil extraction, we have a lot of oil pollution as well, and this is also very characteristic, especially previously it has been, of OPEC countries in South America. For example, a lot of the oil is coming from very here the Niger Delta, but very biodiverse regions, but very ecologically fragile ecosystems. This region has also been a bit of, there's pros and cons, but there's large game, there's large wildlife in this region. And there's been a lot of movement to attempt to conserve the wildlife. But there's also a lot of conflicts that result between wildlife. And again, this has to do with growing tourism to view the wildlife. There's a lot of people are willing, poachers, for example, is another major problem. Human encroachment on protected areas, or I cannot speak today, I apologize. Natural habitats for these species. So we have the silverback gorilla on the left, and then the famous rhinoceros. There are some species where there's virtually just a couple of left. If you follow the news at all over the last couple of years, they've even gone to the extent of cutting off the horns of some rhinos who are in zoos, because they've gone in and they've done this. A lot of the animals in wildlife, they've put the animal to sleep, like with the anesthesia, general anesthesia, and then they're removing the horns, because people will kill the animal, cut off the horn, and leave. That's all they want of the animal. There's also been problems with people killing gorillas for their hands, and then their hands are then used for medicinal purposes, a lot of times in other countries as well. The same with elephants for ivory. So there's wildlife abundance, generally due to low population densities. Also disease. So a lot of the areas you might hear of different diseases, the tsetse fly, the sleeping disease, malaria, dengue, Ebola is another example, which has been a disease that's passed by humans. So a lot of the rainforests can be protected, just because it's not a people-friendly place, to put it one way. However, we see declining wildlife due to what we talked about: population pressures, political instability, poverty. So people, if it's between dying, not being able to provide food for your family, and poaching, this is a situation where people aren't necessarily stealing because they are greedy. It's for a lot of the people, it's stealing. Poachers might be part of this because of survival. There has been an international ban on ivory trade. This has been lifted temporarily for certain times. Different presidents come in and lift the trade. If I'm not mistaken, President Trump did lift the ban on the ivory trade, but the rest of the world still prohibits. When they do lift the ban on ivory trade, there's more animal casualties. Rhinos, again, as I just mentioned, are very threatened. And tourism is interesting because tourism has been a driver for wildlife conservation, yet at the same time, it's not always without problems. So there has been a bit of a push where now locals can be benefited through tourism industries and tourism activities. And a lot of people are going to see the large game. I feel bad calling it game because that implies that we're killing it, but to see the wildlife. So it can be a double-edged sword. There's also a lot of parks, a lot of people who are anti-poaching, so they're even hired to protect animals as well. And again, a lot of people want to go. There's a lot of potential for wildlife tourism, which can result in conservation as well. So climate change in this area, the arid and semi-arid regions are very vulnerable. So we just talked about desertification. Again, this will only be perpetuated through increasing climate change. This region is a part of that as well, especially when we're talking about droughts. Brings us to the idea of food security and food insecurity. We'll talk about this some more with other chapters as well, but this is an interesting issue, particularly in this region as well. So you can see part of this region, and it's largely related to ecosystem and water availability as well. But you can see there's some regions that are highly food insecure, others that are moderately food secure, and then generally food secure. So there's a lot of regions that are very prone to famine. And the famine is directly often related to climatic factors. There can also be political instability and other factors that are involved. But climatic factor, which, desertification, a lot of the same environmental issues, soil nutrient issues, soil loss, these are all issues that will perpetuate famines as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here, and then we'll pick up part 2 with population and settlement.